The medium through which we engage with and understand war is increasingly the video game.
I need you over there! Here they come!
Despite being a relatively new art form, the video game industry has already surpassed cinema as the most lucrative form of entertainment media, with the most popular games being those that feature combat and warfare. And given how quickly the medium is evolving, becoming more serious as a narrative vehicle, more immersive as an interactive experience, and more ambitious as an art form that can provide insightful reflections and move its audience in a meaningful way, it seems only fair to wonder, what do video games really communicate to us about the reality of war? I already made a long video about the complications and contradictions that arise when depicting war in movies, and how existing definitions of anti-war cinema don't always hold up under scrutiny. One argument that was often made is that anti-war media must at least portray a nuanced view of deadly combat, one that depicts the infliction of lethal violence as a norm of behavior and as a force striking down randomly. Another one stated that it has to show both sides. It has to ask if war is just a national tragedy for the victor, or if it is terrible for everybody. And while I believe it is certainly worthwhile to examine how such arguments carry over to video games, especially seeing as video games so often find their inspiration in movies. Take for example how the early World War II shooters recaptured the same moments that people had already seen in Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, and Enemy at the Gates. It would be a mistake to ignore that video games are experienced and appreciated in an entirely different context, which comes with its own set of complications and contradictions. Just look at how this scene in Battlefield 5 clearly wanted to emulate the philosophical musings on war and violence that Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line became well known for.
This great evil, where's it come from?
Does a hidden hand guide it? Birthing us in violence and blood?
Although being an admirable attempt to induce some poetry into its storytelling, and being quite a beautiful moment in its own right, we also see an immediate conflict arising, because whereas The Thin Red Line was able to maintain that contemplative atmosphere throughout its runtime, and in doing so stayed largely consistent in its tone and message, Battlefield also has to be this. The main issue stems from what is arguably the most defining quality of video games, their interactivity. In a video game, you are not just passively observing, but actively participating with varying degrees of agency. Because of this, as Noah Caldwell-Gervais already pointed out in his critique of the Call of Duty series, games have less control than movies have over tone and pacing, over what is shown and what isn't, and over ensuring thematic clarity, which in turn only exacerbates what was already a pretty serious issue that filmmakers run into when trying to create anti-war cinema, which is the audience's relation to cinematic spectacle, and how what to an actual soldier is the harrowing chaos of war can so easily become thrilling excitement for those who are watching, or in the case of video games, playing it from the safe comfort of their home. Battlefield players even seem to purposefully chase after what have come to be known as Battlefield moments, which are basically just spontaneous moments of spectacular chaos, with the qualifying factor generally being, it's so cool it could have been in the trailer. In fact, the studio behind the Battlefield games seems like it has come to embrace its own dualism between wanting to portray war meaningfully while also providing exciting entertainment, as every new game comes with an uplifting story trailer for its more thoughtful campaign mode on the one hand, and a high-octane combat action one for its multiplayer on the other. But even video games that do actively try to offer a more nuanced experience of violence run into this issue. Though not technically a game about war, The Last of Us Part 2 tried to tell a mature story about cycles of violence and clearly made an effort to de-glamorize its combat, as enemies will beg for mercy, call out each other's names, and have other humanizing qualities that would supposedly make players feel more remorseful, or at least have them reflect on the violence they are inflicting. And yet, from a gameplay perspective, The Last of Us Part 2 is a fun game to play. Its mechanics arguably even encourage you to relish in the same violence that it also wants you to reflect on, as is demonstrated by the flood of aggressive, brutal gameplay videos from players who show you how you can go full John Wick and turn it all into a spectacle if you so choose to. Some might see this as a troublesome reflection on these players, but really it's an issue of game design. Simulated violence, especially when it's made out of pixels, simply isn't the same as the real thing, and research has shown that we are actually pretty good at distinguishing between the two, and that we therefore engage with them differently. Therefore, our exploration into the relation between video games and war needs to look beyond the mere aspirations to realism and nuanced depictions of violence that tend to be followed by a misplaced outrage over our enjoyment of it. It's only when we embrace the disconnect that we can meaningfully ask, what can game design really do? Where do its limitations lie? And where does it offer potential for more? Is the video game fundamentally incompatible with meaningful insights into the reality of war? Or is it merely suffering from growing pains on its way to artistic maturation? As with my video on anti-war cinema, the goal of this discussion is not to end up with another dichotomy to label video games as either pro or anti-war, but to construct a deeper understanding of a complicated subject that does not let itself be captured in such simplified terms. So today, let's take another look at humanity at its most destructive. Examine how our interaction with video game violence is contextualized through game design and storytelling, how they reflect and shape our perception of war, and explore the real purpose and meaning of immersing yourself in virtual warfare. This video was sponsored by CuriosityStream and Nebula, the creator-owned streaming service where, besides watching all my videos ad-free and getting access to bonus content, you can now also listen to the first of what will be a series of exclusive episodes for my podcast Cinema of Meaning. In this exclusive episode, Thomas Flight and I discuss the movie 1917. We talk about depictions of heroism and critically examine the relation between cinematic language and war. To hear our full conversation and get access to all future content, sign up using the link in the description, and we will see you soon. As mentioned in the introduction, the defining quality of video games is their interactivity.
Japanese tank is stuck half a click north of here. We gotta hustle. Let's go!
But before we get into the discussion of how gameplay design can offer meaningful insights into the reality of war, or for that matter, detract from it, I first want to backtrack a little bit and elaborate a bit more on the role and potential importance of audiovisual presentation in video games. Because even though I laid out the problem of simulated warfare in relation to spectacle and entertainment, this is not to say that video games cannot be effective at all in giving players an experience that is viscerally intense on that purely audiovisual level. Perhaps even intense enough to invoke within them the feeling that, as Call of Duty 2 once promoted itself with, that they are as close to war as they'd ever want to get. The reason I want to address this is because video games have been evolving so quickly in such a relatively short amount of time. Just consider how fast we really got from here to here.
Do not bunch up.
I remember playing Call of Duty 2 for the first time, this was back in 2005, and being deeply impressed by how it all felt so quote-unquote real. The battle for Hill 400 in particular always stood out to me for having these intense artillery strikes during which you had to run for cover and just wait it out. Right now, of course, if someone, especially someone who doesn't play video games, were to ask me to show them an intense depiction of war in a video game, I'd probably point to this Stalingrad level in Call of Duty Vanguard, where you play as a young Russian woman who is just going about her day until suddenly To be clear, this is definitely not to say that this is a better level than that of Call of Duty 2. We're not yet talking about things like gameplay mechanics, narrative context, and other elements of game design. It's just a small illustration to show how far we've come technically. This fast and, to me, genuinely amazing progression, however, is also what has made some people understandably worried, especially with virtual reality and God knows what other innovations that are still on the horizon. One can certainly wonder how far we can push the immersion until we've pushed it too far. But again, for now, I'm not too worried about this and believe it is fair to assume that we can maintain that healthy disconnect between simulation and reality. The last few decades certainly seem to have proven that just as the technology behind video games evolves rapidly, we also get used to it just as quickly. I'm sure you've had that moment where you played a new game and thought to yourself, wow, this is the most jaw-dropping thing I've ever seen. How could it possibly get any better than this? In fact, I'm sure you've had plenty of these moments. Probably even enough that you've come to see the silliness of them. The silliness of, for one, thinking that we're already at the end of history with an art form that's barely been around half a century. And two, that at some point a magical line will be crossed where the technology itself has fundamentally gone too far, no matter what the actual game design looks like. But the real issue with approaching video games on this more experiential, visceral level, at least for our purposes here, is that its impact is very difficult to judge. It tends to be highly personal and dependent on a player's familiarity with and tolerance for violent video games. With fast-moving technologies, there's also not an insignificant part of it that just comes down to what is the newest, most state-of-art simulation in this brief moment before something else comes along. For example, I mentioned Call of Duty Vanguard before, not necessarily because it was the best example of an intense depiction of war, but mostly because that's the one I played most recently, and its impact therefore hasn't yet worn down for me as much as it probably will have by the time the next Call of Duty game comes around. It speaks to a more general problem when discussing the limitations of and potential for anti-war messages in media. We just bring so much of ourselves into them. In her essay on anti-war cinema, Anishka Monet argued that war films can only be as anti-war as their viewers already are. And this seems even more true for video games. After all, when you have more interactivity and more agency, this means you also have more space to create your own meanings. In this sense, you're essentially playing a game within a game. You are offered a virtual world, a way to engage with it, and you then bring your imagination into it to render it meaningful in your own way. To make all this a little less abstract, here's an illustration that I'm pretty sure you can relate to. Remember how in Grand Theft Auto you at some point would just drive around like a law-abiding citizen, carefully staying in your lane, stopping at traffic lights, and so on. You know you didn't have to. You were aware that you were playing a game where these things didn't matter. Yet you chose to immerse yourself this way nevertheless. When I was young, I used to do a similar thing in the first Call of Duty game. I'd sort of roleplay as a real soldier. I'd imagine that I really was just a single insignificant soldier in a much bigger war. Someone who would cower away most of the time and who isn't the main hero of the story. Now, does this mean that it's all player imagination and that game design doesn't matter at all? Actually, quite the opposite. Though probably inadvertently, the game design of the first Call of Duty made playing like this a really interesting experience. Because aside from having a veteran difficulty setting that gave me more incentive not to be reckless, levels were also designed in such a way where at every stage there would only be a certain amount of enemies. And with your allies playing quite aggressively, it was actually a feasible tactic to just hide and wait until most of the fighting had already been done. In other words, the game design facilitated my own simulation. I say this was probably an inadvertent effect, as from a video gamey perspective, this wasn't good game design, or at least it apparently wasn't seen as good game design by other designers. I remember trying to play this way again in Call of Duty World at War, a game that, for the first time in the series, featured a lot of gore and seemed to really want to emphasize the horrors of warfare. But when you play this game on the highest difficulty, and cower away just a moment longer than the game wants you to, which isn't very long, you are showered with a ridiculous number of grenades. Also, I'm pretty sure there are lots of stages where enemies just keep respawning infinitely until the player reaches a certain point. And so, for a game that wanted to offer a supposedly more honest depiction of war, it certainly didn't want you to play it as such. World at War wants you moving forward, always in the action. In fact, I found that the best way to align myself with the flow and tone of that game was to just set it on the easiest difficulty setting, pretend it was Doom, and lean into its spectacle of violence. And so, even though your own imagination is important, game design still matters as it can help facilitate your imagination and guide it in the right way. And this, I think, is the best framework from which to examine the potential for video games to offer meaningful insights into war. It's not about pretending that players are actual soldiers and that they therefore act and react in the same way, but about understanding them as conscious role players who can be directed through a variety of gameplay mechanics that encourage and discourage specific forms of immersion, and through narrative framing that can offer them the proper context. Let's look at gameplay first.
Gears coming up.
The fundamental question when it comes to gameplay is the question of where and how to provide meaningful agency, and to design this into a basic set of principles through which the player interacts with the virtual world. This results in what is known as a core gameplay loop. In simple terms, in a video game, the core gameplay is the thing you'll be doing most of the time. In popular video games featuring war, this core gameplay loop is virtually always centered around combat. Whether it is from a first or third person perspective, the basic mechanics have been largely the same since the very beginning. You walk around with your gun at the ready and move from cover to cover to eliminate your enemies until the game is complete. While video games have definitely gotten more interactive over time, which we'll get into shortly, it is interesting to consider why this basic aim and fire, i.e. point and click gameplay system has remained such a staple and still tends to define the majority of the interactive experience in war games. Why this insistent focus on the actual combat? Well, this is in large part because the way we play video games makes them biased towards featuring some kind of physicality. As players, we act within a virtual world, but we control that interaction physically in the real one. Gameplay, therefore, is essentially an act of translation between physical input and virtual output. And subsequently, the most immediately satisfying form of that is having your real dexterity enhanced in virtuality. Which explains why the vast majority of video games are either about sports, platforming, or indeed, violence. It is simply the easiest way to make you feel directly connected to what's going on in the virtual world. The easiest way to let you experience the joy of feeling skilled, of feeling like you are the one who is achieving something, who is impacting the virtual world through their own agency. The more fantastical and science fiction shooters perhaps most obviously demonstrate how combat specifically can be turned into a fun gameplay loop through high-intensity maneuvering, imaginative special weapons and abilities, and excessive eruptions of violence that often reward skillful players with climactic finishers. The question that arises with more realistic shooters, however, is if these same mechanics that are pretty much designed to excite and entertain can also be used to convey something more meaningful. For besides the issue of putting players and their quest to win center stage, we'll get into these contextual elements a bit later on, there is something that feels obviously contradictory about aspiring to a meaningful message about war when combat is your main interaction. Because can a game really invoke reflection about killing when that same act of doing so is part of a gamified experience? One that is rewarded with hit markers as in Call of Duty World War II, for example. White for a non-lethal hit, red for a kill. Or as is the case in Brothers in Arms Hell's Highway, with a kill cam that shows you the gory fruits of your labor up close and in slow motion. In the latter example especially, You could argue that it was supposed to show you the terrible reality of bodily destruction that occurs in a war, which would be in line with our initial argument that anti-war media has to portray a nuanced view of deadly combat. But when it is integrated into this gamified version of combat, does it really achieve that goal? Or does it just provide spectacle, a sensationalized reward for that long-distance headshot, or for your perfectly thrown grenade? One significant problem that many games about war run into when it comes to pure gameplay is that their core gameplay loop of moving from cover to cover and shooting enemies until you can move to the next combat zone is simply quite dull. For me personally, even if I'm playing a game with particularly well-designed mechanics, sound design or weapon feedback, I find that the basic routine of shooting enemy after enemy often loses its effectiveness within the span of a few levels. In other words, I grow bored of precisely that which should capture one of the most tense, most frightening and most harrowing aspects of war. This is not to say that video games at all times have to be fun, but they do have to be engaging. And when you strip down a gameplay loop of exactly that which it was designed to do, that is, to entertain and to provide fun and spectacle in creative ways, it seems only logical that you end up with something that is just not that engaging at all. And the thing is, the creators of these games seem to be well aware of this, which is why many of them are filled with secondary gameplay mechanics and other additional game design elements. Many of these, however, seem to primarily function as a break from the monotony of doing the same thing over and over again. Think about unique weapons that are only available for a limited amount of time, or levels that let you commandeer a variety of vehicles. Personally, I was never a big fan of these, as, somewhat ironically, I tend to find them even more restricting and one-sided than the core gameplay. A similar issue arises with the inclusion of more cinematic direction, which in this case often means the inclusion of first-person cutscenes, though theoretically effective as a tool to have more of the tonal and thematic control that movies can offer. My issue with these, however, well, besides the fact that they tend to be used for pure spectacle, I mean, just look at this. What is even going on here? And just when you think it is done, it just keeps going and going. I was going to cut it short, but at this point I might as well let it play out. Okay, my real issue is that they tend to take away player agency either too much or during moments that should have been playable, which in turn only detracts from the immersion as it lessens the potential for players to connect with a game in their own way. The D-Day landing in Call of Duty World War II, for example, certainly looks intense, but the player isn't actually given control until after getting out of the boat. Just a few steps later and it is taken away again so the game can do that Saving Private Ryan thing. After which you move further onto the beach where, you guessed it, you again run into another first-person cutscene. Was it a cinematic experience? Sure. But did it really utilize the potential of the video game to immerse me and provide space for real reflection? For me, not really. And this brings us back to the fundamental question of gameplay. Where and how to provide meaningful agency. For besides the attempts to make the core gameplay loop of war games less monotonous by offering simple secondary gameplay mechanics and by including more cinematic spectacle, there also have been plenty of attempts to change things up and to genuinely try and offer more meaningful engagement. And this is where things get a lot more interesting, and where we can really begin to examine how deliberate changes in game design also change the deeper meanings that they invoke, both for better and for worse. Having laid out the problem of gamified combat, let's take a more specific look at how different gameplay mechanics invoke different meanings, and explore their potential for more thoughtful reflections on the reality of war. Now, as you may have already noticed, I obviously couldn't include every war video game ever made, but I tried as best as I could to play and replay a broad enough variety of different games to pick out some generalizable elements. And so even though I'll be zooming in on specific games, please try and see them as symbolic for similar games as well. Also, keep in mind that many games can be significantly tweaked in their options, which could make them more or less effective in what they communicate about war. But in order not to get too lost in all these details, I mostly played them on their standard settings and regular difficulty. And so again, please don't see this as an exhaustive account that covers everything, but more so as a tool that helps you reflect on and decide for yourself which specific games give you a meaningful experience, and how they do so. One classic issue in gaming is that of player health. Over the years, there's been a general shift away from the static health bar that can only be replenished with health packs, and towards a regenerative one. Why? Well, my guess is that the latter one makes for a more streamlined gameplay experience. When you've taken damage, you no longer have to search for a health pack or medikit or whatever item fixes your health bar. Instead, you can just take cover, wait for a bit, and hop back into the fight. But what does this really suggest thematically? As a player, I always preferred regenerative health, as I never liked being distracted by a health bar and often got frustrated whenever I was pulled out of the action to scramble around the map in search of a way to replenish my health. But after replaying some games that have that classic mechanic, I actually found a way it directs your focus quite interesting. Because what it does is it changes your mindset a bit, as your main purpose during gameplay is no longer just to kill enemies, but also to keep yourself alive. Besides this encouraging you to be more careful, it also symbolically suggests, through gameplay, that being wounded in battle is not something that you just shake off, but that warrants serious attention. More generally, for war games with a core gameplay loop that is largely centered around combat, the appeal towards more realism is a good start to make them more meaningful. By this, I don't mean the inclusion of more blood and guts or trying to bridge the gap between reality and simulation as discussed in the introduction. No, what I mean is the effort to deconstruct and de-emphasize the gamification of combat that makes the act of killing the most exciting and rewarding aspect of a gameplay system, and to explore ways to communicate that war is about more than combat, or at least that combat is about more than shooting enemies. Consider for example how the multiplayer World War II shooter Hell Let Loose does this. Like both Scriptum and Arma, Hell Let Loose is a game that really doubles down on realism. It has no kill cam, no hit markers, no crosshair. The only way to shoot with some accuracy is to aim down the sights, and even this takes a lot of patience and luck. Plus, with players being extremely vulnerable, most of the combat happens over longer distances, against enemies that are very difficult to spot. And so, taking all this together, when you finally get an enemy in your sight, actually shooting them feels rather unceremonious, and often leaves you wondering if you even hit your target at all. What we also see here is the simulation of various other aspects of the reality of combat. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of holding your breath to reduce weapon sway, which is another one of those traits that is present in many shooter games and that many experience as annoying from the perspective of streamlined gamification. But that does communicate something about the focus it takes to actually aim with some accuracy, which in reality is obviously much more difficult than pressing the button to look down the sights, especially during intense situations. Now, you may ask, doesn't this increased difficulty to shoot someone mean that when you actually manage to do it, it will just feel all the more rewarding? In my experience, not really. Because what these added layers of realism also do is partially replace the element of skill with the element of chance. And ultimately, I think we tend to feel more victorious when we feel like we succeeded because of our own qualities, rather than because we experienced a simple stroke of luck. Even more interesting, at least to me, is the simulation of the more psychological effects of combat. One such effect that is pretty common, probably because it's one of the most immediate ones, is suppression, the disorienting distress you experience when you're under heavy fire. Players who are being suppressed usually experience this through hazy vision and oppressive sound effects that invoke them to take immediate cover. But some games also feature suppression as a mechanic through which players can engage the enemy, with probably the most famous of these being the Brothers in Arms series. From the very beginning, Brothers in Arms wanted to offer a more honest depiction of war and of the reality of combat, which to them wasn't so much about shooting and killing, but rather about suppressing enemies, flanking them, and then taking them out. This might sound like a subtle difference, but I believe it's a significant one that's worth discussing, for it gives soldier psychology a much more important role during gameplay. Your targets are not just emotionless AIs who are completely unresponsive to your presence until you shoot them, but by being susceptible to suppression, a more psychological impact, it makes them feel much more human.
Hit him hard!
The Brothers in Arms series, of course, is also known for its squad-based gameplay, meaning that you are not a soldier following orders, but an officer giving them. This in itself already gives you much more agency and even a pretty well simulated sense of responsibility about how you play the game, because unlike other, more straightforward shooters, you never just mindlessly run in, find cover and shoot enemies. No, you are forced to think strategically, and combined with the mechanics of suppression, this results in a core gameplay loop that always has you engaged in the immediate moment. Always considering the placement of enemies, the abilities of your team, the opportunities for flanking, and making sure you and your men make it out alive. As such, Brothers in Arms, for me, has always been a game series that showed how you can have a more realistic take on the shooter while still providing a highly engaging gameplay loop that doesn't have to rely as much on additional spectacle. It somehow manages to make even a simple encounter with a few enemy soldiers on a farm as thrilling as the grandest set pieces in a Call of Duty game. Does it still gamify combat in a satisfying way? Sure, but at least it de-emphasizes the actual act of killing a bit, with the exception of that kill cam in Hell's Highway though, as you can actually play most of these games without shooting anyone yourself. More importantly, however, by immersing you in the nitty-gritty of squad-based combat, and by letting you engage with the wider dynamics that exist between soldiers on the battlefield, Brothers in Arms also really emphasizes that war is not won by an individual, it is not won by you alone. In fact, its gameplay directly communicates that you cannot win this game by yourself, for if you happen to lose all your buddies, completing a level becomes exceedingly difficult, if not downright impossible. And this brings us to another important factor that plays into the meaningfulness of war games, one that has to do with the way the player is framed within the context of the conflict, which ultimately feeds into gameplay as well. For all this, of course, was but the very tip of the iceberg, an overview of the gameplay mechanics that most players are already pretty familiar with, and that mostly function to de-emphasize the heavy gamification of combat while still having a core gameplay loop that's centered around it. But before we can begin to imagine more innovative concepts, we first have to get a better understanding of the way video games position their players, and what consequences this has for the way it contextualizes war.
We're moving out!
The promotional trailer for the first Call of Duty pointed out how, in the Second World War, victory was not achieved by one man, but by the lives of many. And, to again refer back to Noah Caldwell-Gervais's video on the series, there is a contradiction here between the reality of war and the way a video game is fundamentally constructed. Why? Because a video game is naturally player-centric, meaning that it progresses only when the player does. If you die, you go back to a checkpoint and try again. If you quit the game, it will wait for you to return before moving forward again. More than movies, which are more likely to be viewed in one sitting and have full control over their pacing and runtime, video games are subservient to their players.
Jackson, take point.
You know, if I don't feel like going through this door, this entire campaign grinds to a halt. It's subtle, but it nevertheless indicates that in this virtual reality, I am the most important person. I am the one who moves everything forward. It might seem silly to point this out, because it is ultimately a truism about the nature of video games. It's not something they can really change. And I believe that most players are willing to accept this and will even do their best to go along with the facade, so to say. After all, it is understandable that they want to stay immersed in the story and not be reminded of the limitations of the simulation. And yet, the contradiction is worth examining, not so much in a futile effort to overcome it, but rather because ignoring it altogether makes it more likely for a war video game to indulge a player's feeling of self-importance, and to become an uncritical hero simulator, which obviously runs counter to that initial message that war is specifically not about the heroics of one person, but an effort that costs the lives of many.
Our enemy's right in front of us, boys.
First off, there is a way to pretty much sidestep this issue entirely, and that is through the one virtual area where the player is literally not the central figure, the multiplayer. I was originally going to exclude multiplayer war games from my discussion, because looking at the most popular ones like Call of Duty and Battlefield, they don't really seem to try to do anything particularly meaningful. I'd compare them more to something like laser gaming or paintball. You know, they're about friends hanging out, having fun, and then having a beer afterwards as they laugh about how awesomely they shot each other in the face. The latest Battlefield game even started to lean into the playfulness of its multiplayer action, and in doing so, finally turned all the silly things that its players have been getting up to for ages into what it clearly is. A feature, not a bug. And all that's fine, we're allowed to have fun, and many of these games provide exactly that. But when I stumbled across Hell Let Loose, which was my first experience with a more realistic multiplayer war game, not quite a simulator, but close, I also saw a different potential. The first few hours playing this game looked something like this. I promise you there is no way to feel less important than running around for 10-15 minutes on a giant map only to be randomly killed by an enemy you didn't even see. Now you might be wondering, why even play something like this? How is it engaging? Well, I found there is a kind of immersion that is quite unlike anything else. After realizing you cannot approach this game like a regular multiplayer shooter, the final scoreboard doesn't even list the amount of kills you've made, which tends to be one of the more important metrics in other games. You begin to play differently. You start to focus more on the progress of the team instead of just yours as an individual player. And as such, you come to see the value of the more selfless acts like providing suppressive fire, of setting up supply stations and spawn points, of creating diversions, and even of dying, as you being shot during a collective charge towards the enemy might mean that someone else made it through. And unlike single-player games in which you can start to anticipate certain obstacles by playing the same level over and over again, playing with real people like this also means that no one match is ever the same, and that you can never fully let your guard down. While I am excited about what the future of multiplayer games could deliver in terms of meaningful engagement, this is not to say that there is no potential for single-player games at all. We've already discussed some gameplay elements that help in downplaying player centrism with the squad mechanics in games like Brothers in Arms, but there are also some narrative and other contextual elements that are worth discussing. Going back to the first two Call of Duty games, we can discern two ways in which they try to make the player experience feel less like a hero simulator. The first is by having a campaign structure that lets you play the games from multiple different perspectives. Throughout the story, you play as an American, a British, and a Russian soldier. Most later Call of Duty games would also employ this strategy to varying degrees. Similarly, the later Battlefield games even did away completely with the idea of one connected narrative to instead present a multitude of standalone war stories, with each of them focusing on an entirely different perspective. It certainly is an interesting approach that helps to emphasize war as a collective effort through narrative structure, and that creates more potential for anti-war messages. Because, going back to our initial demands for anti-war stories, the realistic depiction of combat and the inclusion of multiple perspectives, a multi-character story structure allows for both, and can even enhance them. When it comes to the realistic depiction of combat, for example, having the player embody multiple different characters can really show them the meaning, or rather the meaninglessness, of violence in war, which, when it comes down to it, is not about gore or other presentational issues that could be misconstrued as spectacle. No, it's about communicating its randomness and insignificance. It's about the idea that no matter how heroic, no matter how self-important you might feel during a war, it takes but a single moment of bad luck to subvert it all and reveal the painfully meaningless reality underneath. And when you have multiple player characters, this is something you can more explicitly communicate. I vividly remember the first time I played that mission in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, in which a friendly helicopter is shot down during an evacuation and you go down to save the pilot. Against all odds, you pull it off, but just as you are ready to heroically fly off into the sunset, there is the now famous twist. The next level then had you crawling out of the wreckage and gave you a few moments to gaze upon the destruction before you ultimately collapse, never to awaken again. By now, killing the player character has been done multiple times, but back then it was unheard of, at least to me and my circle of friends who couldn't stop talking about it. And even now, the way it not only renders your previous heroics meaningless, but also lets you believe that you are somehow going to get up and make it out of there. After all, it is a whole new level, and by video game logic, surely it is going to go somewhere, only to then take it all away from you, to have it all just end. It's quite a statement. The introduction to Battlefield 1 also had an interesting way of communicating the sheer waste of life that occurred during the First World War, as every time you die, the character you embodied is dead for good, and when you respawn, you do so as someone else. As such, it is very likely that in the span of just a few minutes, you have witnessed firsthand the ending of dozens of human lives, thereby giving you a much more visceral understanding of the game's opening statement that this is the reality of frontline combat, and that you really are not expected to survive. One can wonder, however, to what extent the impact of this effect wears off if it were to be fully embraced for the whole game, which might be the reason that it is only employed for its opening level. Because without having any sense of who the person is that you are playing as, I can imagine they start to feel like empty avatars over time, and become mere vessels for the player to project themselves on, at which point the gimmick of switching perspectives might no longer be the deciding factor on whether or not players find themselves in a hero simulator. And so, structural elements like these are not enough in themselves. We need narrative context too. This doesn't necessarily mean that characters in a game need to have a strong identity or fully worked out biography, but rather that the players who embody them are carefully and consistently positioned within the game's story. And the reason this is so important is because narrative framing not only has the potential to strengthen the meaningfulness of a war video game, but also because it has the power to completely undermine it. Storytelling in video games has always fascinated me, because while it can be effective in a traditional sense, that is, by presenting well-developed characters that players empathize with as they control them. This we see in the Brothers in Arms series, for example, where you play someone with a distinct identity. Storytelling in video games can also be done without such characterization. This is more likely to be the case with first-person games, where players take control over a relatively quiet or blank character who functions more as an avatar of the players themselves, as a way to project themselves into a virtual world. In this case, the identity of this quote-unquote character is much more defined by reading the room, so to say, by having non-player characters or other story elements that help you understand your place in the story. And again, this narrative framing is important, even more so than the previously discussed multi-character story structure, because it can really make the difference between a thoughtful story and an uncritical hero simulator.
Alright guys, get set to move. On my command. Let's go, let's go!
Returning once more to the first two Call of Duty games, I mentioned there were two ways in which they tried to downplay player centrism. The first was their inclusion of multiple perspectives, which we already discussed. And secondly, they also made an effort to emphasize how in each one of them you are just playing a regular Joe. Someone who is present for many important moments, but who ultimately is really just an observer to them. In other words, the player character is framed as someone who is experiencing the war, not the one who is heroically making it happen. Many of the later Call of Duties, however, would go in what seems like the total opposite direction. In Modern Warfare 2 and 3, for example, the story is quite literally turned into an action movie with clear heroes and villains. The Black Ops games feature what is by and large a stereotypical, almost mythological view of the Cold War era. And even the later entries that, like the first game, are also set in the Second World War, came to embrace more heroic narratives that emphasize the player's feeling of self-importance. Take for example this moment at the end of the Russian campaign in the first Call of Duty, and contrast it with the same scene in the later released World at War to see how one makes you a bystander, a stand-in for one of the many soldiers who partook in the effort, and how the other one makes you the central hero.
The honor should be yours.
And gives you the ultimate reward for a campaign that already weirdly insisted on making the player stand out from all the other soldiers by having Reznov, the charismatic leader of your team, constantly point out just how special and heroic the player character is.
When he first spoke of Dmitri, Reznov told tales of a hero, someone we should all aspire to be like.
Why is this such an issue? For one, the creation and reverence of heroes, and the embodiment of them in video games, is an act of symbolization, which, almost by definition, imbues them with significance, with purpose, with meaningfulness. And in the context of war, this not only detracts from critical reflections of the reality of combat, as the random infliction of violence is never quite so with heroic characters, who are more likely to die in a grand sacrifice or have their death rendered significant, important even, in some other way. But perhaps more importantly, heroes also tend to create villains. They tend to frame war as conflicts between good and evil, between peoples and nations who are righteous and who deserve to prevail, and those who are not so, who are barbaric, uncivilized, evil, and who deserve to be destroyed, which in turn leads and has historically led to justifications for violence and destruction.
The truth, Walker, is that you're here because you wanted to feel like something you're not, a hero.
One interesting example of a game that critically explored this relation between war and heroism is Spec Ops: The Line. While I don't think it succeeded in everything it tried to do, I'll get back to that later, I do like the way its story brought attention to the concept of hero simulators. You start the game playing as a soldier who believes he is heroically reacting to a cause in need of his help, but who slowly comes to understand that the reality is much more the other way around. Instead of his feeling of heroism being a result of warfare, it was actually the driving force of it. He wanted to be a hero and created a conflict that would allow him to be one.
You needed someone to blame, so you cast it on me.
This sort of blindness towards the way we tend to frame the world and ourselves in heroic language, in a way that tends to generate conflicts instead of diffuse them, sometimes even unconsciously so, is also why the anti-war qualifications that stories should depict multiple perspectives is so important. While this seems like an easy task with the multi-character story structures that so many of these games have, in reality it's a lot more complicated than simply featuring a variety of different characters for the player to control. Again, it's the narrative framing that really matters. It's about what those different perspectives actually communicate. Because even if a game technically has multiple perspectives, This doesn't necessarily have to mean anything if they all reflect one side of the conflict, especially when that general perspective still functions as one big hero simulator. Take for example World at War's depiction of the conflict in the Pacific, where you battle against Japanese forces without ever getting a real insight into their perspective. We only experience the conflict from the American side, we only see the atrocities. And to be clear, this is not to say the Japanese didn't commit such atrocities, they definitely did. But it is to say that the game does absolutely nothing to help us understand the why behind it. Instead, it just hands you a flamethrower, turns on the rock and roll, and lets you be the great hero. The obvious way to balance this out would be to literally show players the other perspectives, to let them play as characters on both sides of the conflict. That is, of course, assuming that this other perspective is not turned into a caricature or only functions to reaffirm the evilness of those who are framed as the villains. Battlefield 5, for example, has one war story that puts you in the shoes of a German tank crew during the final moments of the Second World War. And although I wouldn't say it is a masterpiece of anti-war storytelling, it does immediately demonstrate the humanity that arises when trying to understand the mindset of the supposed enemies. Trying to see them not as embodiments of evil, but as individuals who were shaped by their respective cultural and ideological beliefs. Beliefs that we most likely would have had too if we had actually been in their place. And this is perhaps the real value of showing both sides. It's not just about trying to understand other perspectives, but also about critically reflecting on our own. About holding up a mirror to the ideologies that are driving us, and questioning the ways in which we are justifying our aggression, our violence. One game series that repeatedly and, in my opinion, quite effectively raises such questions is Metal Gear Solid, which tends to frame both its heroes and villains in almost existential terms, thereby adding an important layer of nuance to the otherwise absolutist heroic language. Enemies change along with the times and the flow of the ages, one of the series' pivotal characters points out, and we soldiers are forced to play along. So then what is an enemy? Is there such a thing as an absolute timeless enemy? There's no such thing and never has been. And the reason is that our enemies are human beings like us. They can only be our enemies in relative terms. Trying to assume a more detached perspective like this, one that really tries to examine war from the outside, reveals how beneath the countless different conflicts, there are the same driving forces, the same heroic myths, pushing us towards destruction over and over again. So what are these heroic myths? How do they affect the games we play, and why is it so difficult to deconstruct them? To answer that, we have to examine the deeper meanings that are implicitly perpetuated by war stories, and take an honest look at our connection to them. Now, at this point you might want to have seen my video on anti-war cinema for the full context on the complicated relation between heroism and war, as there I discuss, in detail, the general concept of how individuals are promised symbolic victory over death through cultural hero systems, how these systems are tied to uncritical hero worshipping, scapegoating, and human evil, and how, throughout history, they have repeatedly set the stage for violent atrocities, destruction, and war. What I want to do here is zoom in on two specific case studies, so to say, break down two examples of heroic myths that I believe are most prevalent in war video games, albeit on that deeper subtextual level, beginning with a critical look at something that I did not dare to fully engage before, which is the cultural significance of the Second World War, and the myth of the good fight. Of all the 20th century conflicts, the Second World War still holds a special place in our general culture, video games included. And this, I think, is largely because it just works so well as a story. For one, it is set in a period of history that is still recent enough to feel relatable, but also just old enough to feel nostalgic. It was a time where the promise of modernity was still pure, still unburdened by the reality of its later stage implications that we are reluctantly facing today. Right now, the Second World War also sits at the right point in time for its story to be narrated not by bittered veterans or overzealous patriots, but by kindly old gentlemen who so easily capture our hearts as, all these decades later, they still shed a tear over their fallen comrades. But what I think is the most important reason for why we romanticize the Second World War the most, why we look at it with a degree of reverence that we do not seem to have for conflicts that came before or after it, is because it's the one war that pretty much everyone agrees was a righteous one. It was, at its heart, a classic tale of good versus evil, of allied forces who fought for democracy and freedom against the Axis powers that sought domination and destruction. Now, I'm not here to argue that all this isn't true, but I do want to pay attention to what this story really means to us, and why we are still so drawn to it today. You could argue that it serves as a cautionary tale against the dangers of fascism. The first Call of Duty games, for example, really framed it as such with their educational bits of history in between levels. And although I believe that it's definitely important to learn about grand historical events like the Second World War, and that video games can help spark that interest in further learning, I do wonder, when it comes to our actual understanding of fascism, what are the real lessons here? Especially when they are not adjusted to fit today's socio-political context. Because in my experience, the kind of fascism that we are facing today, at least in Western European countries, is a wholly different beast from that of the early 20th century. Today's far-right movements and related ideologies that employ fascist methods do not seem to be driven by a desire for more Lebensraum. They do not seem to care about establishing a grand new Reich. If anything, with the rise of the European Union, it feels like they came to realize that managing such a large-scale territory with such a wide variety of different peoples and cultures is a lot of work and comes with a lot of difficulties. Therefore, they seek not expansion but isolation. They don't want to conquer the world, they want to be insulated from it. They want to border off their own little bubble so they don't have to care about things like climate change, migration, global politics and economics. So they can live in their own parallel reality, however delusional. And I wonder to what extent the reason we are having trouble to make sense of all this is because our understanding of fascism is still too contained within a specific historical setting and too defined by a specific aesthetic. Take the Killzone series, for example, a futuristic shooter game that depicted the rise of an aggressive totalitarian regime that clearly invoked the imagery of Nazi Germany. And although it did have a fantastic opening sequence, one can ask, did the game that followed it actually provide any real insight into the nature of such a regime? Or was it merely a narrative shortcut to easily point out the bad people? And as such, to what extent can we understand modern fascism if we keep it so strongly associated with these specific characteristics from one historical period?
This place isn't yours anymore.
Though not as on the nose as Killzone, the same is true for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, which also featured a futuristic setting in which a warmongering nation emerges just so the player has enemies to shoot at. And here, strangely enough, we perhaps see more clearly where the real appeal of World War II stories comes from. They are not so much about trying to understand destructive ideologies. They are about our nostalgia for righteous warfare. Considering how we are just getting out of about 2 decades worth of highly controversial conflicts in the Middle East, conflicts defined by terrorism, faraway interventions, technological warfare, and non-state actors that significantly changed our perception of war as a battle between the soldiers of 2 or more nations, and significantly complicated the hero systems we attached to it. The Second World War represents a simpler time, a simpler war, one where the conflict was morally unambiguous, where the bad guys were the bad guys and the good guys could still become venerated heroes after proving themselves on the battlefield. It's no wonder then that this is the conflict we keep returning to, either literally or metaphorically. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, for example, a new world war breaks out that starts with the invasion of the United States and eventually extends to the European continent in Modern Warfare 3. Now, there is more than one way to interpret this story. I'll come back to that later. But the one that matters here is the one that suggests how these games seem to relish in the way they basically transport us back to a 20th century style conflict of total open war. One where our generation too is able to have its own good fight, its own righteous conflict. One question that arises here, however, is why would we desire an assault on what we already have just so we can start a war to win it back? Well, as Ernest Becker pointed out in his book Escape from Evil, because it is better fuel for our hero systems. A war implies an external evil, something outside of ourselves that we can destroy. And this is generally a more appealing narrative than the one where evil comes from within, which generally happens when we actually live in a state of freedom and peace. A state in which our focus has nowhere to go but towards our internal problems, towards the reality of maintaining our society through hard work, self-reflection, and by facing our own shortcomings. And so, as Becker writes, what better way to forge a nation into a unity, to take everyone's eyes off the frightening state of domestic affairs, than by focusing on a heroic foreign cause? Another reason we carry nostalgia towards the good fight is because it also means a return to a time of unambiguous heroes. I don't think it is coincidental that we refer to the people who fought in the Second World War as the greatest generation, which supposedly says something about the qualities of these soldiers. You know, the way they answered their call of duty with such dignity and humility, the way they didn't see themselves as heroes, but simply as people who were doing their jobs. Which of course made us admire them all the more. And again, I'm not here to argue that this isn't true and that these soldiers weren't like that. But I do want you to consider how much this generation is revered because they really were so much greater, or because the context of their war allowed them to be seen as such. After all, when fighting the good fight, soldiers do not need to question their call of duty. In fact, we seem to admire the greatest generation precisely because they so unquestionably answered it. And in doing so, it does feel like we grant them a special sympathy that isn't extended to veterans in later conflicts. In today's globalized world of morally complicated interdependencies and complex political relations, it certainly feels like the heroic myth of the good fight against evil, of the grand justified war that naturally breeds heroes, is becoming an increasingly distant dream, a fantasy to be lived out in the virtual realm. But hero systems are resilient, they adapt, and this brings us to the second heroic myth. One that is arguably even more pervasive in video games, and more deeply embedded within our society at large. It's a myth that doesn't try to justify war itself, but that does try to redeem the warrior.
Copy, Watcher. We'll handle it.
In a congressional meeting about conflict in the 21st century, United States Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld pointed out how overwhelming power has become more important than overwhelming force. In the past, he said, under the doctrine of overwhelming force, force tended to be measured in terms of mass, the number of troops that were committed to a particular conflict. But now, war is no longer defined by grand campaigns, no longer defined by soldiers storming the beaches. No, it's an era of advanced technologies, of unmanned drones, targeted operations, and special forces. When it comes to our cultural perception of war, it's an interesting shift. On the one hand, the growing use of new technologies has led to critical perspectives about the way they create an ever-widening gap between an act of violence and the person who is inflicting it.
Yep, that was right on target.
Take for example the gunship level in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, which became a point of discussion for maybe being a little too realistic, as the screen you're looking through here is almost identical to what an actual gunner would see in this situation. But personally, I don't think the reason that this level is uncomfortable is because it brings you as the player closer to a real-life experience of war. but perhaps more so because it feels like these technologies are increasingly bringing the real-life experience of war closer to that of a video game. Of course, the reality of this kind of combat comes with endless nuances and complications that do not immediately equate it with the disconnected experience of a simulation. In this particular level, there are, for example, no civilians to worry about. And because it's still a video game, there is no real conscience to struggle with, as I'm sure there would always be in real life, no matter how far removed from the action you are. And yet, it's hard to not feel some dread about the ease with which one can end an entire human life by something that looks as insignificant as erasing a tiny white dot on a screen. On the other hand, however, stories of modern warfare have also seen a renewed appreciation of the soldiers that do get up close and personal, especially in the age of terrorism, where war was no longer a clearly understandable battle against a clearly locatable enemy, but rather a confused state of conflict against forces that seem to defy geographical lines and familiar rules of engagement. It seems like we increasingly needed something to hold on to, something that still made sense, at least for the stories we tell about it. And hence the myth of the heroic warrior.
This is a time for heroes. A time for legends.
Although special forces have been part of other conflicts too, they've become especially important for our perception of warfare in the 21st century, as I would argue that they have significantly complicated, perhaps even challenged, what it really means to be pro or anti-war. To elaborate on this, let's take another look at Call of Duty Modern Warfare, which contrasts the bombastic imperialistic campaign of the American troops with the more precise tactical efforts of the British Special Forces. And although I do think that, as we've already discussed, this game has some effective anti-war moments, when taken as a whole, this doesn't quite seem to hold up, as towards the end, it does become a more traditional story of heroes stopping the bad guys in the nick of time and making their grand heroic sacrifice to save the day. But the way it does so is interesting, because by framing these different forms of engagement, with some leading towards catastrophe and failure, and others towards success, it doesn't feel like it's trying to be anti-war as much as it is exploring the potential for meaningful aggression, and by extension, the reality of what it takes to keep a modern society safe and secure. It brings up some larger questions about what it really is that we've been doing here, what it is that we've been looking for. Because what is the true ideal of anti-war? Is it absolute peace, a total rejection of all forms of aggression? Or perhaps something else? For if war is defined by senseless violence, can the opposite be meaningful violence? Can we maintain a general state of peace while still acknowledging the necessity for some acts of violence to maintain it? It certainly feels like a more pragmatic perspective, but here too it is important to remain vigilant. In some ways even more so, because even though this image of precisely coordinated and carefully targeted attacks certainly feels less destructive and more clean than all-out open warfare does, the fundamentals of hero systems still apply. There still is the same risk of framing complicated socio-political issues into simplified heroic causes that subsequently get people riled up for aggressive action, not so much out of rational considerations, but more so out of fear and out of the same old illusion that if only we destroy this external evil, then our society will be safe and secure. An illusion that is all the more tempting to embrace when that external evil is far away and can be taken care of without demanding a significant sacrifice. That is, on the part of the aggressor. After all, in this kind of war, there's no need for all of our sons to be drafted. We just send in the pros. But the real danger here, aside from the potential scapegoating of certain peoples and cultures, is the way it seems to feed into a call for preemptive action. Going back to Modern Warfare 2, for example, the world war that breaks out there started with one act of terrorism, with one single bad guy who, although being Russian in this case, was basically a stand-in for every non-state group or peoples with anti-American sentiments. And as such, its imagery of American suburbs and other familiar landmarks that come to be under siege can also be interpreted as a warning. As a look what could happen if we don't stop these bad guys. Look how devastating it would be if we don't get them first.
Moving to intercept.
It is true that the age of terrorism has awakened a state of fear that was quite unlike anything we had seen before. As the sociologist Ulrich Beck pointed out, the introduction of terrorism, or even just the potential of terrorism, into our collective unconscious significantly altered our risk perception, as war was no longer a conflict fought out on some battlefield, but one that could strike us anywhere and anytime. That's the real terror of terrorism. It doesn't invade countries, it invades safe spaces. It is an attack on our psyche much more so than it is an attack on anything physical. And this naturally has led to fear responses and calls for more aggression.
Why have we got our hands tied? Let's just take the bloody gloves off and fight.
The 2019 reboot of Call of Duty Modern Warfare perhaps best demonstrated how a story assuming this context can still become an uncritical hero simulator. For despite the developers insisting that their game was not political, and that they merely wanted to tell a story about the boots on the ground in the complicated and morally grey world consisting of multiple perspectives. As Jacob Geller's video on that game already explained, there are definitely some specific ideological messages lurking beneath the surface here. Most notably, while it seems to raise the question of to what extent the means justify the end when it comes to our national security. In the end, however, it fixates on its own heroes to such an extent that what this message really comes down to is one that says, as Jacob puts it, that the means are always fine if they are done by the right person. Indeed, Modern Warfare is a game that appears critical of war, but still perpetuates a distinctively pro-war message by projecting the righteousness of the conflict on the righteousness of the individual soldier. Because in their eyes, the soldier, at least the one on our side, is always right. They are the ones who see clearly through the fog of war, who are actually out there being brave and courageous, and who are not afraid to get their hands dirty to serve the greater good.
She was going for a bloody detonator.
Good job we dropped it in.
Though Modern Warfare presented a specific expression of hero worshipping, it is a kind of sentiment that also fits in the broader perspective generally described as hate the war but love the warrior, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's the idea that even if we cannot justify the war, we can at least find some meaning and humanity in the virtues of the soldiers who fought it, like a tiny flame of hope in what would otherwise be total darkness. Although you could argue that stories that really humanize these individuals heighten their anti-war potential by making us empathetic to their suffering, it can also work against it. For they can weaponize the sympathy and sentiment that we almost naturally develop for these individuals to prevent critical reflection on the larger political movements and power dynamics that got them there in the first place. Going back to the Metal Gear Solid series, this is another aspect of war that it frequently brings attention to. That heroes, or rather, the concept of heroes, is not just the relaying of value from one individual to another. It is also a political tool. It is used and abused for political propaganda and other ideological purposes. But it's not just shady higher powers that weaponize sympathy and sentiment. In a way, we do it too. We admire heroes in part because they can serve to ease our own conscience, as we are inevitably a part of the same cultural system, the same hero system that ends up sending some people into war, possibly never to return, so that we at home can enjoy the feeling of heroic victory by vicariously living through them. And so calling these individuals heroes for doing so, for making that sacrifice, is not just a comfort to them, but to us as well. It is important to note, however, that more often than not, this lack of criticalness is not born out of malicious intent or driven by a deliberate warmongering agenda, but by compassion and a basic sense of human decency. It would take an especially cruel person to walk up to grieving parents and tell them that their child who was killed in action did so in vain, that war is a state of failure that fundamentally renders all acts within it meaningless, that it is just a total and purposeless waste of human life. And yet, this is what a true deconstruction of our hero systems would imply. It would invalidate the entire stage on which these individual acts of heroism, and any kind of meaning really, arises, which is also what makes it so difficult, perhaps even undesirable. For there are some existential truths here about the essence of hero systems that are hard to ignore, that perhaps should not be ignored. Yes, war is inherently a collective effort, and should be critically examined as such, but we are not an ant colony where, when one worker dies, it is unceremoniously replaced with another. Psychologically speaking, we are individuals. We want to believe that our actions have meaning, that our lives matter, even in something so destructive and senseless as war. And this, at their heart, is what hero systems provide. They let us exchange suffering for meaning, and death for symbolic immortality. And we cannot entirely do away with that without falling into nihilism and despair. We need some structure, some collective sense of existential security. So, where does this leave us? What does all this mean for the war video game? Or better yet, what can it mean? I was recently watching the demo for the new Unreal Engine set within the world of The Matrix. Like pretty much everyone, I was amazed at the graphics and the promise of yet another leap in video game technology. But there was something that stuck out to me too, and that was the gameplay, which, compared to the innovative design of the presentation, was almost comically simplistic and felt just all too familiar. To be fair, this was but a tech demo, but still it is telling something about the way we still seem to be more focused on the creation of awe-inspiring virtual worlds than on imagining creative and meaningful ways to actually interact with them. And especially when it comes to war games, the games that, no matter how much we try to deny it, do come with politics, ideologies, and other meanings that reflect and shape our perception of humanity in its darkest moments. This feels like kind of a shame. I don't necessarily blame game designers for this, however, because they are the ones standing at this new frontier. There's no path laid out for them, and as we've seen, there are no easy ways to navigate something as complicated as war and our relation to it. For when you have an interactive medium that inherently gamifies reality, what is the true potential for meaningful engagement? How, if at all, can you gamify the more complex psychological effects of war? The strange sense of boredom that many actual soldiers describe having experienced. The dread of anticipating an attack. The trauma of being hurt. The grief of losing a dear friend. Press F to pay respects, a quick-time event during a torture scene. It doesn't feel like we've yet found the right answer. But based on our discussion, I think we can at least imagine some progress in gameplay mechanics that serve to de-emphasize player centrism, to deconstruct the hero simulator, and to generally begin to convey war more thoughtfully while still offering an engaging experience. One interesting game that was recommended to me is This War of Mine, which puts you in the shoes of a group of civilians struggling to survive in an active war zone. And a survival game it really is, as its core gameplay loop is centered not around combat, though there is some combat in it, but about ensuring the physical and mental health of your characters by maintaining their shelter, scavenging for food and supplies, and keeping up their morale, which you can do in part by having them interact and engage in supportive conversations with each other. While the game is quite challenging and a bit somber, it does give you a much more insightful look into the reality of war than most other games do. And it does so through a gameplay system that I found absolutely engaging, and I would love to see some of those elements included in other war video games as well. This doesn't mean that every war game has to become a civilian survival game, but I'd be curious to see what they could blossom into if they were to transcend the limitations and conventions of the shooter genre a little bit. To name but one small example, it always kind of bothered me that shooters have you walk around with your gun steadily in your hand, even if you're in Stalingrad in the dead of winter, or in northern Africa at the height of summer. I haven't encountered a lot of games that really simulate these more environmental effects by having, let's say, your weapon shake in your hands if you're experiencing a freezing cold, running the risk of fainting if you sprint for too long in places with extreme heat, or getting stuck in the mud after a rainy day in a World War I trench. Long before Brothers in Arms Hell's Highway came out after a somewhat troubled production, there was a fascinating, now almost forgotten demo guided by a military advisor that presented a lot of interesting gameplay elements that unfortunately didn't make it into the final product, and that feels strangely aspirational now. Among other things, it showed more interaction with your team and more in-game storytelling outside of combat. This scene, for example, that is fully playable here seemed to have been repurposed into this moment in the final game, which was all cutscene. Also, in the demo, the world seemed more open, with more civilians to encounter, and your squad mates appeared to have an interesting fallibility to make them feel more human.
Now, as Randy was saying, these soldiers act like real soldiers. You notice that one soldier just fell as he came off that wall. Those things really happen in real life. You're carrying real ammo, you're wet, cold, hungry, and tired. You're scared, you make mistakes.
Again, the important thing here is not just the introduction of gameplay elements that shift the focus on the excitement of combat away towards less violent interaction, or that make the player feel less like the central character. No, what really matters here is the critical examination of how gameplay systems are related to hero systems. How a player's interaction with the virtual world is driven by or rewarded with heroic purpose, and how to subsequently guide this into a meaningful, reflective gaming experience. Because, to again quote Ernest Becker, if you talk about heroics that cost mountains of human life, you have to find out why such heroics are practiced in a given social system. Who is scapegoating whom? What social classes are excluded from heroism, what there is in the social structure that drives the society blindly to self-destructive heroics, etc. This, it seems, brings us back to Spec Ops: The Line, the game that consciously deconstructs how aspirations towards heroism can lead to self-delusions which in turn become the driving force for violence. And yet, this isn't the full picture either. Because while the game certainly succeeds in breaking down its own hero system, and I still admire the game for that ambition, it offers no real alternative. And as a result, it feels like you're being forced to engage with a limited set of gameplay mechanics, which in this case is just the run-of-the-mill shooter mechanics that you are already well familiar with, while at the same time being asked to embrace a narrative about how problematic that engagement is. And that to me just feels cynical. It creates this vibe of, look what we made you do. Like you're being blamed for not sticking to your diet by the same people who only offered you cake. In fact, it goes as far that some people have even commented that the only way to really win this game is to stop playing it, to just not eat the cake. And indeed, it seems that this is even hinted at in the game itself, as towards the end a character remarks that your whole mission was to leave the city instead of enter it, which would have prevented all of this.
None of this would have happened if you just stopped. But on you marched.
Although I still feel like this creates a bad faith relation with the audience, I tried to do exactly that on a new playthrough, hoping for some secret ending. I tried to just leave right at the start, but alas I couldn't seem to do it. And honestly, if you're going down this route, I should have, especially considering the game already went through the effort in other areas to offer you some out-of-the-box interactive options. In this scene, for example, where you are threatened by an angry mob, if you wait too long they become violent and kill you, so it seems like the only option is to shoot your way out. But there's a somewhat hidden alternative, which is to fire your gun in the air, scare everyone away, and resolve the conflict without spilling any blood. It is but the smallest requirement for what is necessary, because as Becca continues, critically deconstructing our hero systems is not enough. You have to actually set up some kind of liberating ideal, some kind of life-giving alternative to the thoughtless and destructive heroism. You have to begin to scheme to give to man an opportunity for heroic victory that is not simply a reflex of narcissistic scapegoating. You have to conceive of the possibility of a non-destructive yet victorious social system. And I believe the same goes for gameplay systems. Can we conceive of non-destructive mechanics that offer players the same thrill, that same excitement of heroic action as destructive ones? Can we imagine, as the American philosopher William James once set out to do, a moral equivalent to war, and then gamify it? Some game designers certainly seem to have been trying. When Hideo Kojima, for example, created the Metal Gear Solid series, non-lethal and stealthy combat was already encouraged, but I feel that with his latest science fiction title Death Stranding, he was trying to push the boundaries even further by designing a gameplay system that is not centered around interpersonal conflict at all, but rather on establishing connections, both within the story of the game world as with other players through its innovative online mechanics. As to its successfulness with regards to it being engaging enough, I'll leave that up to you, but it should be noted that the task ahead is not just one for video game creators, it's ours as well. As players, we too have to engage ourselves, be mindful of how exactly we immerse ourselves in virtual worlds and why we really do so. If anything, we can at least be more open towards and curious about new forms of interaction, about games that do seem to make an effort to explore that liberating ideal, to experiment with engaging gameplay systems focused on giving life instead of taking it, and to offer us a true hero simulator, non-destructive yet victorious. Hey everyone, thank you so much for making it all the way to the end. With a video of this size, that's genuinely amazing. Anyways, if you're interested in going even further, I'd love for you to listen to my new podcast episode on 1917, which is available exclusively on Nebula. You may already know Nebula, as there you can watch all my work and that of many amazing creators without any ads or sponsors, and get access to exclusive and extended videos. And the reason you can now also find exclusive episodes of Cinema of Meaning there is because Nebula is a creator-owned streaming platform, which means that we as creators get a much fairer share of the revenue, we have protection against demonetization and unjust claims, and that we can rely on the support of a strong community while providing all of you with ad-free and exclusive content. Right now, the best way to get access to Nebula is through our friends at CuriosityStream, the educational streaming service with thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles. They have some great series on military history, for example, that have really helped me to better understand the larger political context of the conflicts discussed in this video. But whereas CuriosityStream is all about big-budget, non-fiction productions like these, they also love independent creators, which is why they are helping us to grow our platform Nebula. And which is why we have this great deal right now to get both services for less than $15 for a whole year. So if you'd rather be watching extra content instead of this ad, enjoy some fantastic documentaries, and listen to exclusive episodes of Cinema of Meaning, be sure to head on over to curiositystream.com/likestoriesofold to get the best deal in streaming today.